Everyone who joined us, welcome. This is a webinar, part of actually the first one in a series of webinars that we're going to have about US elections, the election of Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States for second term. So we call it Trump 2.0, basically, from that perspective. We're going to be discussing with Dr. Richard Weitz today from the Hudson Institute. He's going to talk about the U.S. foreign policy and the implications regarding the election of Donald Trump. In the upcoming weeks, we'll have a few more webinars, which we're going to be inviting people to as well, talking about more specific arenas, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Iran, and so on and so on. So at this point, Richard, please feel free to share your screen with your slides. And
Okay, is that happening now?
here it is. I think that's yours, right?
I
Yeah.
think, okay.
Yeah, we're
Yeah,
seeing your screen. So just
okay,
your full
very good.
screen.
Okay, yeah, but let me, so let me, okay, so full screen it's done through the application, right? Is that right?
Yeah, there you go. Stage is
Okay.
yours, Richard.
Okay. Thank you very much for hosting me. I'm honored to give the first presentation of what will be a series of webinars by experts on the Trump administration's potential new policies, approaches, doctrine, and so on. Since this will be the first, I'm going to try and give a high-level overview, talk a bit about the people, the philosophies that might animate the administration, the kind of options they might consider, and the kind of challenges or problems they might run into. And then we'll let the other speakers, which I believe you can find and sign up for them on the Wikistrat LinkedIn page, or Tally. I'm sure we'll send out links to everybody afterwards to sign up. But there are a whole bunch of them that go into detail about specific regions and so on. Now, I'm aimed this mainly to be raising questions for discussion, so I'm going to leave substantial time for that, and people are welcome to make comments as well as raise questions. So if you have an assessment of a particular issue, please share it with us so that we can consider it. Since a lot of it's a bit early to tell, particularly regarding policies. So regarding people, it's become a little clearer of what President Trump is looking to do. He is explicitly trying to empower people who we think will be radical disruptors. The Trump team blames much of the traditional U.S. national security establishment that has been in power in both Republican and Democratic administrations in earlier periods for making major mistakes in U.S. foreign policy. In their view, this group is still animated by views that may have been applicable 10 years ago or earlier, but are no longer that appropriate for the new conditions we're facing, and for some poorly executed policies. Even if they agree with the goals, they felt that they can do a better job in achieving them than the previous administrations. What is interesting about many of the people we're seeing of the appointees or proposed appointees that need Senate confirmation is that they don't have much experience, leadership experience in particular, with the agencies that they're going to run. We've seen this not only in the national security field, but also throughout many of the appointments. And I think this is a reflection of President Trump's desire to ensure that these people will prioritize loyalty to him rather than loyalty to the agency they're put in charge. There's a traditional concern about agencies capturing those. I've seen this expressed in concerns about many of the agencies that in the U.S. government, that once you put a person in charge of that, they'll start seeing themselves as a defender of their agency in an interagency process, and rather than the proponent of the White House views to enforce them on the agency. There's also, the view is perhaps stronger in this case because of some perceptions by the Trump team that there's a deep state at work. This isn't totally incorrect in that his first term, he often found it challenging to, the White House would, for example, declare that U.S. troops are leaving Syria, and then 6 months later, they're still there. And so, I mean, there's clearly was some effort not to fully execute, or at least in a timely manner, some of President Trump's stated policy preferences. The team also is looks to be very innovative in the sense that they have many non-traditional views on the topics of purview of their agency. Views that would challenge what the agency would consider to be proper behavior and what previous heads of these agencies have pursued, be it regarding medical issues, be it regarding education, or in this case, national security issues. There's also an effort to particularly to put people who are younger in charge, give them look very vigorous. They look good on TV, they have good communication skills. So it's this, I think we saw this before, perhaps in the 1960s with the Kennedy administration desire really to, show that they have a lot of energy and are eager to tackle the challenges facing the United States. I think the end result of all this is that President Trump may feel more comfortable delegating many decisions to these groups so he could just focus on the most important issues. Clearly some issues are going to be very important to him, China, jobs, immigration. Others, he can feel comfortable letting the particular people in charge decide what should be the force deployment in a particular region, or how much to which vaccines to approve and so on. Now, in terms of the substance, the views stated by these people differ on various issues, particularly China. Yeah, I think that's most of them, but Russia as well. We can get into this, but and other questions. It doesn't. I think that the White House feels it's going to lay down what policies it wants to pursue soon, not after he takes office. So far, a lot of it we don't know, and then the group will fall into line. They will implement the president's agenda rather than their own. I also think we're going to see the next round of appointees be the deputy cabinet secretaries, and they're probably going to have more executive or managerial experience. For example, in the Defense Department, it's just a large bureaucracy. If you have a secretary who's known for his or her intellectual thinking, perhaps a reformer in some ways, Les Aspin or something, then you want to have a good deputy who knows how to manage the building, keep the ship moving, and so on. And that's it's true with all these agencies, but particularly the Pentagon. We may see a return to this idea of a Schedule F. Currently, the White House can appoint some 4,000 political appointees throughout the U.S. federal government. About 1,200 of these require Senate confirmation. But at the end of his previous term, the administration proposed expanding the number of political appointees and making some changes in the civil service system that would perhaps make it easier for the president to dismiss people or reassign them and so on. That was not fully executed by the time President Trump left office in January 2021, but it may, at least they have been statements that they plan to return to this issue to give themselves better control over the federal government. In terms of their philosophy or doctrine of military power, we're not having the worries we had the first time President Trump was elected that, he's going to get us into a war, a nuclear war, we're all going to die. I mean, President Trump actually showed himself in office to be restrained in his application of force. He didn't get into any new major wars. He felt comfortable using short, discrete applications of force, such as launching missiles against Syria after the Syrian government used chemical weapons, launching the assassination or killing of General Soleimani, head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and his Iraqi partner. And these were often designed simply to de-escalate, restore deterrence, respect. And in some cases, it worked. I mean, there was a fall off in chemical weapons use for a while in Syria. The Iranians stopped attacking U.S. forces. The Biden administration has done the same in this year periodically in Iraq and elsewhere, using a major strike to get the other side to back down to avoid drifting into a larger conflict. The administration, perhaps the one novelty we might see is a greater desire to use the military to execute immigration policy, particularly National Guard, and that remains to be seen how that will occur and whether the governors will cooperate and what they'll do. Some don't. In terms of organizational changes, we know a bit more about what they plan to do with the Defense Department and the other agencies because the transition team has discussed their desire and the Defense Secretary nominee shares these views. They want to remove command layers, so allow a warfighter to use a missile, for example, against a fleeting target without having to get 5 sign-offs or just be able to get a single or 2 people to approve. They want to remove non-military requirements, such as meeting climate commitments or diversity and equity inclusion goals. And basically, it'll reduce some civilian interference, such as legal restraints on the use of force in controversial situations and so on. So the idea, another reform they want to do is reduce the number of generals and shrink the staff, re-optimize the changing tooth-to-tail ratio. The new National Security Advisor, Representative Weitz, put it a little more simply. He said, we want more lions and less sheep. So that wasn't, the next quote is from him, but one of the transition team described it as more lions and less sheep. They also want to expand defense contract opportunities for non-traditional suppliers, such as high-tech startups. There's been some articles in the paper today and yesterday that the Deputy Secretary of Defense may come from that world, somebody who's a non-traditional defense company manager or principal, someone who's eager to push innovation along, not a Lockheed Martin, not a head of Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, but some of the newer companies that are working on AI, drone, cyber, and so on. There is some discussion that they may establish a so-called warrior board. This would be comprised of perhaps mostly former military officers who would review the performance of the current officers and where they are failing, either not approve further promotion or try and get them removed. And their particular reference to the Afghan withdrawal, and we've already seen the Senate hold up the promotion of an Army general who was involved in that in anticipation that's going to be something held against this person in further promotion consideration. And they want to, as they describe, keep the military from engaging in politically contested issues. That is, they don't want members of the military testifying for Congress about the value of diversity or other issues or respect for law that they think should be that communication they think should be left to the civilian leadership. In some ways, we're going to see some reversal of the policies of the past 4 years. So they're going to curtail funding for abortion, travel, DIA programs, climate change and information resilience programs. They may restore names of the previous Confederate era names to certain military bases. President Trump may reinstate a ban he had on openly transgender people serving the military. Beside whatever philosophical differences they have about these kind of policies, they also say they've been detrimental to force readiness. And so, for example, they'll say that it's become more difficult to recruit people from families that traditionally have been sending their children, their sons, to the military for several generations, and so they want to start, drawing on that legacy and encouraging that feeling of a professional corps that with traditions going back, decades. And much of these views are seen in SecDef nominee Peter Hegseth's book, which President Trump read, War of Warriors, Behind the Betrayal of the Men Who Keep Us Free, sort of gives away some of the themes. It was basically, we want more lethality, accountability, meritocracy, and bless other goals, restraints and non kinetic goals that are seen as hindering progress. But there's still some uncertainties on how the president and team will approach the use of force in the military, national security issues. So it's a debate. It's still under debate whether, this diversity and other recent changes are causing problems or helping to resolve problems. Are they gaining more recruits or fewer recruits because of the changes? I think the data is still out on that, so that will remain an openly debated question. There's a debate between them over readiness versus procurement. Some of them are very concerned about needing to get more munitions now and boost industrial production, bring industries back up to Cold War levels, and this could entail reducing transfers to Ukraine, for example, and other measures. But others are more concerned about building the army for the next war, or the military for the next war. And this is represented by Mike Waltz, who's now going to become the Trump's national security advisor, said we need fewer bespoke Ferraris, more pickup trucks. That is, rather than spend $250 million for a next generation fighter, you might be better off with many more cheaper drones. No firm commitment, but just a desire to consider this question. And then there's going to be trade-offs. Do you want to focus on near-term readiness, more pay for the troops, and bring in munitions, or do you want to save money by retiring some of the current systems so you get more funds for next generation development programs? And I think that's going to be an issue of debate as well within the team. And President Trump also said that he's in favor of Iron Dome missile shield for the U.S. Now, clearly, the Iron Dome isn't what he had, specifically the Iron Dome system isn't what he had in mind. That's a system for defending against short-range missiles such as Hamas launches, but it's sort of, we're taking this as a generic desire for missile defenses to shield the United States. But the previous first term, the administration didn't necessarily spend a lot on missile defense. There's perhaps going to be more of a commitment to build up the nuclear force, hypersonic system, some other things that the team has said in the past they want. In terms of the broad tools of power, the non-kinetic ones, there's not, despite potential worries in before the election, there's President Trump and his team haven't said they plan to leave any of the existing alliances, even if they've made clear they don't want to expand them. So Ukraine and NATO is not going to happen soon, but disbanding of NATO is not something that's seen as immediately likely. It seems more likely they're going to focus on trying to get increased defense spending. President Trump saw that as the major achievement of his first term, and that maybe more host nation support from South Korea and Japan and so on. There may be a deprioritization of NATO rather than its disbandment. I mean, the thing, what stood out remarkably in the current administration, the Biden administration, is how many President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and so on have been spending decades working in the European context on transatlantic issues. And so they were really felt comfortable in that realm. That doesn't appear to be the case from a lot of the people that President Trump's appointing. A couple do, but a lot of them don't come from that world. They don't have this strong connection with foreign allies, in Europe. Perhaps Middle East, Israel, they have some ties, perhaps even, but less so maybe in Japan and South Korea. I mean, still sorting it out, but it's less, we know that traditionally there's a view of alliances not as inherently good of themselves, but as instruments, tools of power, something that can benefit the U.S. if adjusted appropriately, but not, you don't want to make the commitment so strong that it impedes your freedom of action. There's much for NATO, at least it's going to depend on what happens in Ukraine, which I know is a subject for a later webinar. In terms of some of these new pacts that have gained a lot of importance under the current administration, even if some of them predate them, Quad clearly predates them. The AUKUS and was under discussion in previous administrations, but it really came to fruition under the current one. The new deal between Canada, Finland, and the U.S. to build Arctic icebreakers. Not quite sure what's going to happen with those. I imagine the administration will review them as part of its review of all national security strategies, but what's going to ultimate decision regarding them, not a bit unclear. In terms of economics, a lot of emphasis on sanctions, perhaps more against Iran, or at least more effective application, more severe application of existing ones. But perhaps you could trade off some, so they may be willing to reduce some regarding Russia for an appropriate deal in Ukraine. Maybe China, there'll be fewer impediments in some area in return for concessions in others. Tariffs, seen in a somewhat different category. They're mainly desire to reindustrialize the U.S., benefit the U.S. Industries. Favor, I think, on bilateral trade and economic agreements rather than multilateral ones. So I expect the Canada-Mexico-U.S. agreement to be renewed since President Trump negotiated that, but in some other cases, less clear. So I don't think there'll be such a pact with all of the EU, but there might be one with Britain, for example. A lot of emphasis on energy dominance to gain international leverage. So U.S. produces a lot of oil and gas, and that will weaken the revenue and leverage of Iran and Russia and gain the U.S. more influence over China and so on. So energy is seen as a national security issue. Fewer restraints on emerging technologies. So the current administration emphasized a lot AI safety concerns. I think the next administration is going to be more ambitious about getting AI into U.S. national security systems sooner and more comprehensively. And many of the people working with the administration come from that world, the AI high-tech developers. Some difficulties regarding anticipating what the Trump administration will do. I'm sure we'll revisit this in the future some webinars. Often, President Trump it tactically can be obscure what his objectives are and what he's trying to do to gain a tactical advantage. And then he does show flexibility in some issues. So clearly he's against climate change, but regarding China, he did reach deals with China on imports that held back some tariffs, and maybe we'll see a deal on TikTok. So he can show flexibility on many issues. He'll listen to the arguments and then decide. What happened with the Attorney General nominee shows that Congress and media opposition can still impede planned appointments and presumably planned policies, despite the magnitude of the Republican victory this past election. The allied governments can contribute to these concerns indirectly by talking to their allies in Congress, media, and think tanks, or resist directly, but I think their influence will be less than in the first term. One big uncertainty is how this focus on reducing deaths and deficits and the debt and the deficits is going to impact the funding available for national security and economics and State Department and everything. The focus of this dodgy plan is more on domestic regulation, reducing these regulations, reducing administrative discretion, requiring agencies to implement only what authorized specifically of congressional legislation. But a lot of it also is on cost savings. They want to, reduce funding by large amounts, and that could impact defense spending and other national security spending. For example, in their article I cited in Washington Journal, they were very critical of the Pentagon for repeatedly failing audits of what it's spending. The Democrats may gain control of one or more houses of Congress in 2026. Often you see the cycle of administration wins, has 2 years of control of both houses of Congress, but then naturally the pendulum starts to swing back. And then it will have lame duck status growing over time. That will mean his influence may decline within the United States, but that may prompt him more to engage in foreign policy issues. Last parting thoughts. So the Republicans divided on the defense spending. Some want to double it or go back to Cold War levels. A lot of emphasis on peace through strength. They anticipate that the economic policies of the Trump administration will lead to higher U.S. growth, will reduce waste, fraud, and abuse, and that will mean that will help free up a lot of the funding they need. But there's the dodgy effort. There's tax cuts. Inflation could rebound. There are growing external threats, perhaps from North Korea that were less evident at the end of the previous administration. And the House, there's a narrow Republican majority, which means that those Republicans that emphasize budget cutting opposed to all federal programs are going to hold a lot of influence, and they could block planned spending increases, deficit increases, and so on, as they have in the past. And they only, the Republican leadership will need to either win them over through concessions or appeal to Democrats to support them, which they can often get for these issues, but is then can become a threat to the Republican House leadership, as we saw in the previous Congress. One way they might be able to solve this problem about wanting very ambitious national security programs and other programs in other areas is to have retrenchment not only in federal bureaucracy, so not only reducing Department of Education and other U.S. domestic departments, but perhaps curtailing some U.S. strategic requirements, close the end means gap. Some of these strategic restraint advocates have been prominent during the election and may have influence in policies and general idea. Unobjectionable parts are relying more on U.S. allies and entering the protracted wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, but no additional defense. But some of it will depend on whether President Trump can leverage his diplomacy to reduce the threats from Russia, China, North Korea through perhaps new deals, perhaps other measures. If this succeeds, it could allow for some defense spending cuts, but a lot of uncertainty whether this is the strategy they'll pursue and whether it will have enduring results. So that's it. So thank you. And I'm eager to hear people's questions and comments and observations.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this a lot of stuff you went over, and it's very interesting. So I'm going to start with, let's call it the big dinosaurs in the room. The Russia, Ukraine, then I'll move to Iran. Middle East right now, Lebanon is on the go, so I'll keep it a little bit there. But let's start with Russia, Ukraine. First question, what do you see the Trump administration changing from the current administration? Because it looked like since Trump won the election, the current administration basically has been on a kind of a run to approve as much as they can before the new administration takes over, from allowing the weapons to be used inside of Russia to missile defense, air missile defense being provided, and so on. So, what is it the expectation that you feel will be the change in the new administration versus the current one?
Right. I'm going to give you an answer that you're going to hear often the next half hour or so, which is there, it's under active debate. I've heard different views from different people, and nobody knows what President Trump will choose. So some of the people associated with the Trump administration say that the U.S. policy under Biden has been too restrained, that they'll take months to approve a weapon system after Ukraine asks for it, and then finally it's delivered, and by then it's too late, or the numbers are too small to make a difference. So they're saying, President Trump should, turbocharge this, give the Ukrainians a massive surge of weaponry and assistance, and that will quickly end the war, and then you can cut back. So you make a big upfront investment for long-term gains. Others are advocating whatever it takes just to end the conflict. This could likely involve freezing the current front through an armistice, promising that Ukraine might leave NATO, might not be allowed in NATO, and so on. And others are counting on President Trump, just he would, call Zelensky and say, you need to make this agreement, give up this and this and this, or we'll cut off your aid. And you'll call Putin and you'll say, well, you need to make these concessions. You've got to roll back your claims to all of these 4 occupied territories and not demand, changes in the Ukrainian government, or we're going to go ahead and do that surge we discussed. And that will force them to some kind of agreement, sort of like the Camp David type model, or the Iran nuclear talks, that the U.S. would talk to the
Yeah.
Ukrainians, they'll talk to the Russians, and they'll reach an agreement. But that way the Ukrainians don't talk directly to the Russians, proximity talks. And then there are variations in between. So we just don't know. We know that the goal is to quickly end the confrontation, but yet what that will entail. If Richard Grenell is rumored to be being appointed special envoy for this, he's very comfortable with confronting people, so he could perhaps try and bash, the positions of Ukrainians and Russians together. We have seen some um, some of the the signs Ukrainians are willing to make more concessions than they were last year. But we haven't seen that in the Russian, at least overtly. And President Putin and his government partners are still insisting on demands that the U.S. and Ukraine would find unacceptable, which is retain all 4 of the occupied territories, roll back U.S. sanctions, changes in Ukrainian domestic policies, as well as non-membership in NATO. So I think the problem is going to be mostly on the Russian side. But I think one approach that may be different is the Biden administration had the line that there's going to be no solution or decisions regarding Ukraine without Ukrainian participation, and the administration
Mhm.
may relax that, with President Trump talking directly to President Biden, to President Putin, and working out some kind of deal, and then presenting it to the Ukrainians for discussion, debate, and perhaps acceptance. So there may be there's going to be a difference in process, I think. There'll be more effort to restart talks, get the U.S. involved in talking with the Russians. But particular parameters of the deal, whether the Russians will accept that, that's where I think the doubts appear.
Okay, we're getting a lot of good questions. I'm going to get through them. But first, let's stay on this topic of Ukraine. Where do you see President Trump and the NATO alliance? It was before in the first presidency, and you mentioned us in your presentation the relations with the European countries wasn't so good, and the demand was to increase their budget increase. But this was before Ukraine, and now after Ukraine, those countries have been doing so. I would say without having to be asked to do so, seeing the need to do so. So where do you see these relations between Trump and NATO going to?
Right. So Trump, I think they'll pick apart NATO and focus on particular countries. So I believe he's going to give the Canadians and a couple other countries that are not, in his view, spending enough a bit of a tongue lashing. Um, but those, whereas, and but have presumably good discussions with those countries, and particularly Eastern Europe, that are meeting those defense commitments and are, open and more have governments that he finds more acceptable. Again, I don't see any indication they want to break apart NATO. But I think a good sign is the proposed ambassador that he's made for NATO. This person is close to Trump, works on and work, but he's more he's a lawyer and worked with Trump on his various cases, but served in the Justice Department. It doesn't have a NATO background, so I imagine that his function is to go to NATO and focus on making sure that President Trump's views are committed and put forth, and trying to disrupt the alliance. If they're going to pursue the policy of strategic retrenchment, I think that they will probably count on reduce the U.S. force commitments there after the Ukraine war is over, and tell the Europeans they're going to be more responsible for their own defense, and the U.S. is going to focus more on Asia or just cut back on its force commitments. So I think that it's going to be often country by country rather than NATO-wide, and then what's NATO-wide is going to be a function of what's going to happen and their overall global response to, how much they want to spend in defense and security. Do they want to prioritize particular regions of the world, and can they feel comfortable relying on other countries to fill the gap?
Now, I want to move to Iran. It seems that from these elections, many were looking at and seeing that this administration, the one we're going to have based on the appointments that Trump announced, is going to be very hawkish towards Iran. What do you think is going to be the policy of the administration towards Iran? Is it going to be back to maximum pressure and what it was before, even more tougher, or are we going to see maybe a different type of strategy this time?
Right. I'm just going to flag the fact that there'll be a separate webinar on Iran by a person who knows more about
Correct.
Iran than I do. So that aside, as far as we can tell, it's they're going to return to the maximum pressure type approach. They felt that was, that's a good way to um, force the Iranians to make concessions eventually, and in the near term, deprive the Iranian government and the IRGC of resources that it can use to, pursue its nuclear weapons program if it has one, which they think it does. Cut back on support for terrorist groups, proxies, and this would include, Hamas, Hezbollah, the groups in Iraq that are aligned to Iran, and the Houthis, and others. Um, There'll probably be working closely with the Israelis on the Iran question. I mean, I think, one question is going to be, does, do to what extent they're comfortable supporting further Iranian Israeli military strikes inside Iran. Um, but I don't think the U.S. The President Trump himself wants to get into war with Iran. He had several opportunities the first term, such as when the Iranians shot down a UAV, a very large, expensive UAV, or surveillance UAV off Iran, and National Security Advisor Bolton was very eager to use this for an opportunity to strike Iran, and President Trump demurred. So I think it's mostly sanctions, maximum pressure, and this will also extend to other countries. So I think they feel that President Biden wasn't severe enough on China, for example, or for importing all this Iranian hydrocarbons, and so they're going to try and enforce those secondary sanctions on other countries. Um, it's also what things though still aren't clear. Would they eventually try for some kind of deal to cap the Iranian nuclear program? President Trump said in his first term that that was the ultimate objective of the sanctions. He wanted a deal, but just better than the JCPOA, something better than the Obama-Biden team had negotiated. And another uncertainty is how the Ukraine war is going to affect this, and Russia and Iran, and to what extent the Iran question will become an object of discussion between Russia and the United States, and so on, and so there's somewhat interconnected. It extends the Iran question. It extends now, unfortunately, into the European theater, as does the North Korean question, and so on. We're
All right, let me run through a few of the questions here. They're very good questions. Let me try to put some organization into this. So I'm actually going to start from the last one we received, which is about, and I heard that also from experts in Japan when I was in discussions there. Uh, President Trump is probably going to ask for countries hosting U.S. troops, like South Korea, for example, Japan, for those countries to increase the amounts they're paying to the U.S. And many of those countries have raised concerns about that because, obviously, not only from a budgetary point of view, but also they feel it's a bit of an extortion in a way. What do you think this is going to happen? Is that going to be implemented? Or is this just a kind of a chip on the table in order to negotiate it? How do you see this policy? And is it going to be
right.
applied to all of them and it's the same, or is it going to apply only for a few?
Well, since all the host nation agreements are different, I think they'll probably reflect that. They're not going to have a uniform um, policy, but the principle is going to be the same. Yes, they want them to pay more. I believe the South Korea and the U.S. just recently drafted terms of a new host nation agreement. I'm pretty sure the Trump administration is just going to throw that out and start the negotiations afresh. So yes, they're going to demand more payments by these countries for hosting U.S. bases. They're going to demand they purchase more U.S. goods. Um, they um, they may, have flexibility in particular issues, perhaps if the Japanese continue to co-develop hypersonic missile defense systems and other advanced systems with the U.S., that will give them the credit for that. Perhaps if South Korea, does something regarding North Korea that President Trump wants, and that might be considered substitute. But I'm pretty sure they're gonna. I mean, I don't see any opposition to this idea of getting the allies to contribute more, even though these contributions have increased, as you point out, regarding many NATO countries, and in the case of Japan and South Korea as well. So I'm sure they'll demand more. They'll probably get less than they demand. And, it's basically, I think, a financial transaction as far as the Trump team's seeing it. They're going to want more um, to free up funding for other purposes.
Another question I received here in the chat, which is interesting, and I'm jumping into a different topic. You mentioned in your presentation the AI Manhattan project, and one of the questions is essentially, what is that? Like, is that going to be basically constraints that it's going to be just in one nation state, going to be built by the United States? Is that going to be like a consortium of companies? Is that going to be what are we talking about here that the administration wants to do this Manhattan project for AI?
Right. So, what President Trump hasn't really spoken about this, but some of the tech people backing him have been concerned the current administration has been too focused on, safety issues, discrimination issues, other questions regarding AI, and they fear that the Chinese, in particular, are going to use AI to the disadvantage of U.S. military power, and so they want to have the government relax these regulations, restraints. What isn't clear is how much they want the government to fund, this. So the Manhattan Project, as we know, is all funded by the U.S. government, and employees work for the U.S. It's not going to be the case here. I think, these are clearly going to be determined by the private sector. Most of the funding will come from the private sector. But how much the federal government will support this effort, or the CHIPS Act and so on. It's still, it's a debated philosophical question. Some Republicans in Congress are more comfortable with others about having the federal government play a role in this kind of industrial policy. Others want to rely more on the free market and are somewhat concerned about the influence of big tech. I imagine that that some of President Trump's key advisors, you know, Peter Thiel, Musk, others will have some influence on this deliberation. But for now, it's just been pretty much a slogan, but that generally incorporates the idea that you're going to focus more on AI, remove some of the constraints, and take advantage of the opportunities it offers.
Last time he was in office, President Trump pulled off kind of an unexpected move when he was meeting with North Korea leaders Kim Jong-un in Singapore. It was a surprise, and a lot of people were kind of amazed that such a move was made. It was also during his presidency that the talks with the Taliban has launched and started in Doha, in Qatar. So for many people, they're saying the so-called Black Swan event with Trump is not going to be so much a war related, but more of a negotiation related. Um, what do you think is going to be the surprise move of this administration? Like, kind of the whispers and talks that's going on that might be a change in the administration, and something that will be a bit of a change, drastic change in policy than previous ones.
Right. So as I mentioned, President Trump does show flexibility on his tactics and some of his goals. So yeah, North Korea was remarkable first year in office. They were exchanging nuclear threats. President Trump made this very negative speech about President Kim in the UN and got the same back from the North Koreans, but then switched over to doing something no U.S. president had done before and was opposed by the Washington establishment, which was directly talk with the North Korean leadership. Um, that failed, but it shows President Trump was willing to consider out of the box solutions to enduring problems. Um, I think that in the first term, we might have said he might try and work out a deal with Russia. I think that's not really possible now. I just think that the constraints are too great. But maybe China. It's as I mentioned, but again, you're going to have a webinar to focus on this. The people around Trump, his advisor, are very concerned about Chinese economic behavior, predatory economic policies, but they're somewhat more debate over how much China is a military threat that the United States needs to deal with. So does the U.S. need to do what President Biden does and explicitly affirm that the U.S. will use troops to defend Taiwan if the Chinese try and launch an outright invasion similar to what the Russians did in Ukraine? That's still under debate. There's questions now about revising the harsh approach to TikTok or Chinese investment. So it could be that we'll see some kind of deal on questions that will resolve some of the recent tensions. That if President Trump thinks it benefits the U.S. and I think that deal with Russia, Iran, these are all possible, but certainly he is open. The kind of policy options his team are considering are much broader than the range of options that have been commonly considered. Or the previous administration was very traditional in how it was approaching North Korea, Russia, and so on. I think perhaps somewhat harsher line than China than previous Democratic administrations, but certainly in line with the general consensus and in Washington, D.C., that China has become more of a concern in recent years. I think President Trump's open to all sorts of ideas. And so I think, yeah, if we're going to, I'm definitely anticipating surprises, even though I don't know what those will be presently.
Do you think, from a perspective of looking at the Department of Defense and the Trump administration's relations with it, Are we looking into kind of a massive change in the way things are being done there? You mentioned a few things such as non-conventional companies competing for a defense contract, but also there's already talks about changes in the army, for example, when it comes to service of transgenders and elements of the when we talk about generational recruitment of servicemen and so on. How is that going to impact the relations between the administration and the Department of Defense? Because it looks like many supporters of Trump's were in that establishment. So, is that going to be something that's going to play well, or is that going to be something that's going to sour the relations between them?
Right. So I think, some of the goals they have are clear. Just with respect to non-traditional suppliers, the Defense Department has been trying to do that. They have a special defense innovation unit that works on non-traditional suppliers. But the current critique has just been too little. There's still too much focus on legacy systems. It's still too hard for a company that hasn't dealt with the Defense Department to break in and get a contract, even if it has a better idea. Um, I think the way it's been described is that by some of the Trump people is it's like a hostile takeover. So
Mm.
they've described this for the whole federal government. It applies in the Defense Department too. But just as President Trump managed to gain control over the Republican Party and squeeze out the traditional establishment in many of the in many party positions and in Congress. So his view is he's going to come into not his view, but at least the view of his people is that Trump administration will come in, seize control of the bureaucracy, and point more people in more places, embed them throughout the system, remove bureaucrats that in the past sabotaged his efforts or opposed his views. Um, you know, this is not obviously going to be welcome by the civil service and the congressional allies. It may, in many cases, what they're going to do is going to take a lot longer than they anticipate. So removing a lot of the regulations they want to remove could take years, not months. Um, you know, there'll be legal objections, even with a favorable Supreme Court. It's going to take a while for them to get there. There's a lot of invested interest, so we'll have to see. Probably they're definitely going to try for some major changes, but also going back to some earlier policies, as we discussed in the Defense Department. Many in defense will resist. Many will applaud the changes as overdue. The U.S. military and which the U.S. in general hasn't done particularly well in some recent wars, and some in major intelligence failures. Some successes. Clearly, Ukraine, there was a lot of successes, but in other areas, there's been less so. So a lot of people are eager to look for new major changes, but it's a lot harder to change the federal government than it is to take over a corporation and change that. So we'll have to see, but that's the intent to make major changes in many areas.
Um, Two more questions before we end, maybe three if we manage to squeeze that. One about the U.S. nuclear posture under Trump. Are we likely to see a change or a continuation of the current nuclear posture?
Yeah, great question. So the current administration has been changing the U.S. policy under the pressure of events. So when it came into office, there was a desire to get back to arms control, particularly with Russia. So they quickly renewed the New START agreement, but also trying to work with China on developing confidence building measures and other talks. And restore the Iran nuclear program put it back under some limits, some kind of nuclear deal. That's all failed. So they were revising their policies. They've been raising the issue in talks, some of the senior Defense Department people and national security people in the past year, particularly in the DC think tanks. They've been saying, well, we're probably not going to get another major arms control agreement. The Chinese nuclear buildup is just making the current policy, current nuclear posture, which the nuclear force, which is basically developed at the end of the Cold War, when we thought we would just have to deal with Russia that would be constrained by a treaty, no longer applicable. So there's a big search for new frameworks. Now, the Trump people, his advisors, put forth various ideas. One, which just came out in Foreign Affairs article, was just take the Biden nuclear posture review, which allows for these changes, and just go with them, make the changes that the administration, current administration laid out. These are possible changes we're going to need to make to deal with the new threat. That is, develop, develop more systems, spend more money on nuclear forces than we really would like to. So go ahead and do that. Others have said you should just take the Strategic Posture Commission. This is a report that was brought out by a congressional commission, included both Republicans and Democrats, basically supported the idea of major increases in conventional and nuclear forces by the U.S. Unless a new arms control agreement were to rise, which they consider unlikely, rebuild the nuclear establishment. And others want to go even further. I think the Heritage Foundation put out a study about the kind of what should be the next nuclear posture review, which called for increasing the number of warheads now by putting back some warheads that were taken off existing systems to meet arms control treaties, while pushing for the producing faster and longer, that is, by more than you originally anticipated, of some of the new strategic systems, such as the V-21 Raider bomber, strategic bomber, more increased submarine production. So I don't know. You're gonna have to weigh this against costs. How much you want to put in conventional forces, how much you want to put in strategic forces. If President Trump wants to build a national missile defense, much more effective than the current one, how much you want to prioritize that. So this is one of the debates we're all eagerly watching. They're going to set up a nuclear posture review process. They'll consider this, clearly concerned about the rising Chinese threat, clearly desire to respond to this, probably quickly realize that North Korea is not going to cap its program. But what the ideal solution is and what can be sustained by the U.S. nuclear enterprise, which is having difficulty producing even a small number of, new nuclear packages and nuclear delivery systems. That, we know the Sentinel, for example, was just the new ICBM is just costing much more than people had hoped. And so it's some tough choices ahead.
Let's try to make this one two short ones. Space. Elon Musk is on his team. Where is the U.S. defense going when it comes to space, considering Elon Musk and considering Trump previous administration investment into that?
Right. So Trump, sees himself as father of the Space Force and, felt that was the right decision. Clearly, he went to see the latest, Elon Musk rocket launch. So this is an area he's very committed to. We'll probably see further efforts to increase launch capacity, rely more on advanced civilian suppliers, probably allow the International Space Station to die and rely more on private sector space stations. Consider enhancing U.S. responsiveness to deal with contingencies in space, be it attacks on Earth from space, cislunar space, lunar. One area, though, that it's going to be a bit controversial is this debate over whether the Space Force should have its own reserve component. Some of some people want to take the people, particularly in the Air Force, who deal with space issues and take them out of the Air Force National Guard and create a new Space National Guard or Space Reserve Corps. The governor, many of the state governors are unenthusiastic about that because the National Guard, well, they use that for other purposes. So this was a big, hot debated issue in the previous couple of years in Congress and among the governors. And I think that the administration will need to make a decision on that. But I mean, space is clearly an area where they're eager to spend a lot and expand capacity. Same with hypersonics. That's another area they're going to prioritize, and AI, as discussed.
Last question, and I think that's a good question to kind of wrap it all up. Are we heading to a more turmoil, chaotic international relations scene, or are we going into a more stable, less chaotic? And I want to remind everybody, despite of Trump's rhetoric and his actions and so on, the the Afghan negotiation started, the Abraham Accord started, and Ukraine didn't happen in his watch. So I know that a lot of the concerns among many is that Trump's bring a period of uncertainty, yet for many, Trump actually brings more hope and more potential for resolutions of many old age or pending issues. So where are we heading, in your opinion?
Right. So the critique you laid out is that that commonly heard in the Trump administration that, the last 4 years, he's even said this during debates, they've been wars, chaos. Man, the Biden administration brought along very talented people and pursued very traditional policies and through some of them well, such as bringing in the allies again into the Ukraine conflict. But the outcomes have been subpar, and you've got these unfinished wars, perhaps losing a war in Ukraine, the wars in the Middle East breaking out, no new peace agreements with Iran or North Korea. So Trump says, well, we got to restore deterrence, respect for the U.S. That may bring a better world, but critics will say, well, if you're going to hurt U.S. alliances, not pay sufficient attention to climate change and so on, then these will bring long-term costs. And so, it depends on your perspective. And because I think in different times in the Trump administration, you would have cited different achievements and failures. Same with the Biden administration, same with all. It depends on your perspective. We can be optimistic that a new approach could bring better results than previously. But, the Russians have the saying that, I tried to make things better, but they turned out to be the same. So who knows? Those
Who
nine.
knows?
Yeah.
All right, Richard, I want to conclude with that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for an interesting discussion as well. Just a reminder for everybody, this is the first out of a few, out of many actually webinars we're going to be conducting all the way into January, talking about the U.S. New presidency under Trump and their foreign policy and foreign relations. So again, thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody who joined us. And this is it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.